everyone. This is the Cambridge Political Intellectual History Workshop. Hopefully, the first of many. The idea behind this was actually to sort of decenter South Asian intellectual history and political thought away from the kind of great men focus it has had in recent years, and perhaps take it into directions of vernacular sources, intellectual alterities, and also to try and think of the everyday political, because more and more that our landscape is being defined by right-wing populism globally, we think that there is a dearth of possibilities that grand meta narratives can achieve as a counter to right-wing populism. Perhaps it is also an attempt to focus on the everyday political. Uh, your mic is off. Possibly.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, there's a lot of feedback from someone's mic. Can we all please mute speaker?
Yes. Could everyone please mute their mics unless they're presenting or asking a question? Keep your microphones, your audio devices. There's an option there. You can keep it on mute throughout the session. You're free to sort of keep your cameras switched on, but keep your audio devices switched off. Okay. Yeah. So the idea was to focus on the everyday political, which I think is a focus of the newly emerging applied history and doing history in public. The focus has been that, which is also defined by the kind of chairs that this panel would be seeing, and also our chair for the day, the presentations that this panel would be seeing, and our chair for the day. So without further ado, I'll introduce our chair, Professor Nandini Guptu. Professor Nandini Guptu is Associate Professor of South Asian Studies at Oxford Department of International Development and Fellow of St. Anthony's College. She was head of department between 2012 and 2016, educated in Calcutta and at Cambridge, trained as a social historian. She is the author of The Politics of the Urban Poor in Early 20th Century India. The book was published by CUP in 2001. She's also been the editor of Enterprise Culture in Neoliberal India, Routledge 2013, and joint editor of India and the British Empire, published by OUP as part of the Oxford History of the British Empire series in 2012, and Persistence of Poverty in India, Social Science Press, and Routledge 2014. While her past research has been on colonial India, her current research is concerned with social and political transformation, cultural change in contemporary India in the wake of economic liberalization and globalization. She has published articles on a variety of subjects, including caste, communal, and religious politics, urban development, poverty and labor, work and employment, media and politics, and social movement of sex workers. She has taught at Cambridge and Oxford universities. Welcome, Professor Guptu, and welcome to all the presenters. I will hand over the mic to Professor Guptu for the deliberations.
Thank you very much, Rohit. This is a real pleasure to be able to be part of this endeavor. It's a very welcome endeavor, and this is clearly the right way to move forward in our pursuit of intellectual history. So thank you for inviting me. So I would like to invite the first speaker to present her paper, and I'll take a few minutes to introduce her. So the first speaker is Dr. Shivangi Jaiswal. She has a PhD in modern Indian history from the Center for Historical Studies at JNU, Delhi. Her thesis was entitled Representing Labour, Dalits, Workers and the State in India, 1942 to 1955. And this is an interesting history of the period when Dalit politicians held the labour portfolio of the Government of India. Shivangi has also worked on research and archival projects in the field of labour history, including the Integrated Labour History Research Programme of the Association of Indian Labour Historians and the V.V. Giri National Labour Institute. Her paper, Caste and Labour in the Official Discourse of India, analyzing the grammar of caste in the Labour Department, 1942 to 52, was published in the book The Vernacularization of Labour, edited by Shobhoshachi Bhattacharya and Rana Beha. Shivangi currently teaches history in the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program and Middle Years Program at Pathways, Noida. So, sorry, I've somehow lost the screen. Over to you, Shivangi.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you, Rohit, for giving me the opportunity to present my work in this very important workshop. My paper is called Representing Interest, War and the Making of an Indianized Executive Council in the 1940s. This paper is part of my PhD thesis that looks at two competing policy perspectives on organizing labor in the crucial decade between 1942 and 52. In this paper, I draw my understanding of interest representation from Sabyasachi Bhattacharya's work on the colonial state. Interest representation was an essential category of political thinking in the colonial constitution-making process. This idea implied co-opting different strata and classes in the legislative machinery of the colonial state. The colonial state structured a system of representation that would have credibility and legitimacy. The British bureaucracy evolved the idea of a separate representation of each interest in society. While in the 19th century, the focus of the colonial state was for ensuring this representation to the landed aristocracy and British business interests in India, it extended to cover other groups in the 20th century. These included Indian business interests, educated urban professional class, urban labor, Dalits, and non-Hindu communities. Till the middle of the 1930s, the representation of different interests secured them only a voice in the legislature. It did not secure influence in the colonial political system. By the turn of the 1940s and India's involvement in the Second World War, the colonial state's aim was no longer limited to securing a voice. Its objective was not merely to confine to having the opinions of the natives. Instead, the strategy was to look for potential collaborators and strengthen the position of the colonial state by strategically Indianizing its executive council. The British government introduced political reforms 2 decades before the outbreak of the Second World War to increase the involvement of Indians in the administration. However, it was for the first time in July 1941 that majority of the members, 8 out of 12 of the Viceroy's EC, were Indians. In 1942, it was the 15-member council with 11 Indians as opposed to a 12-member council with 8 Indian members in 1941 and a 7-member council with 3 Indian members in 1939. On 3rd September 1939, Viceroy Linlithgow unilaterally dragged India into the Second World War. Opposing this decision, the Congress provincial ministries resigned in October-November 1939. The resignation of provincial Congress ministries created a conjuncture full of possibilities for groups eclipsed so far by the Congress and the Muslim League's domination in the national scenario. In his statement, India and the War, on 8 August 1940, the Viceroy underlined the need for the establishment of a body which will more closely associate Indian public opinion with the conduct of the war by the central government. The offer also assured to safeguard the position of minorities within any constitutional scheme in the future. What triggered the reconstitution and subsequent expansion of the Executive Council was the attitude of 2 major parties, the Congress and the Muslim League, towards the India's involvement in the Second World War and British government's reluctance to meet the guarantees they sought in return for their cooperation with the war effort. The Congress strongly opposed India's involvement in the war. The Muslim League wavered in its official position towards its support for the war effort. Linlithgow's decision to expand the Executive Council in 1941, Srinath Raghavan observes, was undertaken for 3 reasons. First, the need for mobilization for increasing workforce and resources for the war required greater Indian presence in and association with the government. Second, the Viceroy's attempt to appease the rising resentment in India, even among those who had been supportive of the war because of the prolonged and complete gridlock in politics. Third, the need for satisfying public opinion in the United States and Britain following the civil disobedience campaign in India. Having failed to enlist the support of Congress and Muslim League in the formation of the wartime EC, the Viceroy turned to individual public men or representative of their communities, like Dalits, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, and not backed by major political parties in India. After the resignation of the Congress ministry, the colonial state looked for disgruntled elements across communities, offering support to the war efforts and claimed to represent their quote-unquote interests. Different groups willing to support the war efforts offered to cooperate in return for opportunities which they would not get otherwise from either the Congress or the state to come after the war. Such collaboration was, thus, a pragmatic consideration of their interests. Stafford Cripps, one of the members of the war cabinet, made an interesting note about the strategy of the colonial government in its approaches to extracting maximum war effort from different sections in India. The first approach was to work through an agreement from all the representative Indian communities, an approach Cripps tried during his mission and it failed. For him, the organizations representative of Indian communities were Congress and Muslim League. The second approach was to attempt to rally to the active support of the United Nations all sections of Indian opinion which are prepared on conditions to cooperate. The attempt to follow the second approach required the colonial government to approach different sections through both communal and class lenses. That is, various sections of the Indian population were to be approached as Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians, or as landlords, industrialists, workers, and peasants. Attempting to advance through the communal lens would have invited demands for concessions from different communities, which would have made the post-war situation difficult for the colonial government. Therefore, the alternative approach was to concentrate upon an immediate policy of putting right some of the most deep-seated wrongs which affect the mass of the people. The strategic move was to focus on the section which was central to the production of British war efforts, that is, the Indian workers. Cripps noted that the appalling condition of Indian workers and peasants in India was due to their exploitation by the Indian mill owners, landlords, and moneylenders who were quote-unquote financial backers of the Congress. The colonial government succeeded in combining the communal or identity and the class interests, which I argue in this paper was central to the strategy for expanding and reconstituting the Executive Council. There is a long lineage to interest representation, guided by the category of class. As Sabyasachi Bhattacharya has argued, interest was a surrogate for the category of class for British bureaucracy. I suggest in this paper that by the 1940s, the colonial state relied on the logic of identity, which was at a tangent to the idea of economic interest in reconstituting its EC. It reconfigured its notion of interest representation along the lines of identity and associated it with class categories. In doing so, it worked out a more comprehensive understanding of identity as being socially, economically, and strategically constituted. While the colonial government gave wartime conditions as the official justification for the separation of portfolios and creation of new portfolios within the EC, the stories behind the scene paint a different picture. The colonial state was keen to sustain its legitimacy, which was under threat, given the fact that it had to function during the wartime without cooperation from two major Indian political parties, the Congress and the Muslim League. The colonial government was at its best in deploying a spectrum of identities and interests in striking a balance in its Executive Council. The EC constituted a cross-section of principal communities and interests in India who offered to cooperate with the war efforts. It was composed of quote-unquote Indian public men of great political, administrative and industrial experience, representative of the principal communities, Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, repressed classes. It included 5 Hindus, 3 Muslims and 4 other minorities and 3 They represented almost every interest that could be influential in mobilizing for the Second World War: land, business, industry, and labor. Apart from the political leanings and personal expertise, the British officials, as their telegram exchange revealed, discussed at length the religious and caste identities of members to be considered for appointment in the expanded Executive Council. The colonial government attempted to deploy a broad spectrum of identities and interests, not only to form its Executive Council in 1942, but also its new Executive Council in 1945 after the Second World War. Their concern was to maintain a balance between caste Hindus, Muslims, Indian Christians, scheduled caste, and ensure geographical representation for Madras, United Provinces, Bombay, Punjab, Bengal, Bihar, and Central Provinces. I explore in this paper how identities and interests intersected in the colonial imagination to secure the support for the war efforts. The paper discusses various principles the Viceroy followed for strategizing representation in the Executive Council. I discuss in this paper private correspondence among British officials regarding the communal aspect for dividing the portfolios within the EC and making appointments of Indian members to the crucial portfolios of finance, defense, and labor. India was a significant base for many of the Allied operations, and hence the Indianization of certain crucial portfolios such as defense, home, and finance led to debates among British officials. The War Cabinet, for instance, was worried that an Indian finance member might restrict the war expenditure. The Viceroy also hesitated from the position of communal representation, saying, quote unquote, if you are dealing with the Punjab with a predominantly Muslim ministry and the finance minister is a member of the Hindu Mahasabha, or if you have a Muslim finance minister and there is a difficulty with the Hindu province, it does not take much imagination to envisage the sort of trouble that is going to develop. Similar were the discussions during appointment of an Indian home member in the EC. The concern was thus not only the representation of financial interest within the state, but also the identities that would represent these interests. The Indian Army, recruited mainly from Muslim majority provinces of Punjab, was considerably present in the Middle East, North and East Africa during the war. It was important for the colonial government to keep the Muslim League on the table for post-war discussions because it represented, quote unquote, the only organized opposition to the Congress. The Viceroy did not want to bring them together in opposition to the colonial state. The plan was to maintain a strategic geographical balance with the appointment of one Muslim representative each from Punjab, Bihar, Hyderabad state, Bengal and Madras. Another concern was to represent all communities within the Muslims such as Shias, Bohras and Sunnis. The roads to securing representation of different communities within the EC was not smooth. The process of reconstitution of EC met with constant pressures and threats from different quarters in lieu of the wartime support offered to the colonial government. These threats had repercussions for restructuring the EC. Ambedkar opposed Cripps' focus only on Congress and Muslim League for negotiations and at being excluded from the expanded Executive Council in 1941. The anger demonstrated by Dalits in Bombay over this issue had put pressure on the Viceroy to include Ambedkar in the expanded Executive Council in 1942. The Viceroy proposed to expand his council further to include representatives of the Sikhs, Dalits and European community. To do so, he suggested the creation of two new portfolios by separating war transport from communications and by creating a portfolio of defense to be held by an Indian. Having cooperated thoroughly with the war efforts, Sikandar Hayat Khan strongly argued for representation of Punjab in the Executive Council. The threat of resignation from the Punjab government if the British included no Punjabi in its Executive Council and the rumor of allotting the defense portfolio to a non-Punjabi had implications in the formation of a separate labour portfolio of the Government of India. Under such wartime pressures, the Viceroy proposed the creation of a labour portfolio by separating labour from commerce and finding a place for a Punjabi Sunni in the EC. The establishment of a defense portfolio under a non-official Indian was itself a marker of the wartime pressures under which the colonial government was working. Interestingly, the vacancy created by appointing a Muslim defense member made way for the first Dalit leader to lead the labor portfolio of the Government of India. With the transfer of Feroz Khan Noon to defense, the Viceroy proposed to replace him with Ambedkar, whom he considered the only representative of the depressed classes. The Executive Council thus became a place to manage questions of representation and parity in a context that marked radical shifts in the representative politics in India in the 1940s. One of the striking congruence that demonstrates this strategy was the allotment of labor portfolio in the EC in 1942 and the new Executive Council in 1946 to the politicians of Dalit origins. This paper demonstrates how the wartime produced a historical conjuncture for an increased demand for representation of marginalized voices within the state. It focuses on the demand for securing Dalit voices within the Executive Council by two Dalit leaders, B.R. Ambedkar from Maharashtra and his political opponent Jagjivan Ram from Bihar. Ambedkar assessed the political opportunities opened up for minorities after the resignation of the Congress ministry on one hand and by the Second World War on the other hand. The colonial government saw Ambedkar not only in the capacity of being representative of Dalits, but also as representing the interest of labor, given his social origins in the laboring caste of Mahars. Following the separation of the labor portfolio from industries, commerce and supply, Homi Modi, a Parsi businessman with the Tata Group, was made in charge of the supplies. The colonial government further balanced the Executive Council by appointing another Parsi businessman and administrator Ardeshir Dalal as in charge of the planning department. This strategy of representing minority groups, Dalits in labor, Parsis in the supplies and planning departments, served in the best possible way the wartime interest of the colonial state. Such a system of representation also gave credibility and legitimacy to the colonial state. The wartime Indianization of the EC and appointment of a Dalit leader as a labor member was a very innovative measure. On the one hand, it allowed the colonial government to cast war efforts as the defense of India rather than the empire, and at the same time depoliticize Congress' critique of India's involvement in the Second World War. On the other hand, the battle against fascism produced a conjuncture when representative politics in India was taking a new turn, with identities becoming central to colonial states' concept of interest representation. Following a similar strategy, Jagjivan Ram was given the labor portfolio in the interim government. The decade spanning 1942 to 52 was the only decade in Indian politics when politicians of Dalit origins held the labor portfolio of the Government of India. While there are hardly records of a serious dialogue between Ambedkar and Jagjivan Ram, there were striking parallels in their politics in the 1930s. This paper explores the parallel yet contradictory politics of these two figures in the 1930s to demonstrate the two models of Dalit politics that the colonial government deployed while making appointments in the labor portfolio of the Government of India in the 1940s. I would conclude with a few important points that this paper argues. The wartime Indianization of the Executive Council was an innovative strategy which set a precedent for the administration of the post-colonial state. The colonial state proved to be more sensitive to the context than major Indian parties like Congress or Muslim League. The primary focus of the colonial state was on the war efforts, and everything else was subsidiary to sustaining it, for which they made several conjunctural adjustments. Its real interest was to mobilize the disgruntled anti-Congress elements willing to cooperate with the war efforts. It deployed different strategies of mobilization and instituted changes in its mode of governance in response to the political developments during the war. Its approach was to correlate which interest or class could be represented best by individuals with what identity. During the wartime, different segments of the political spectrum negotiated and collaborated with the British, motivated by the pragmatic considerations of their long-term interests. While Ambedkar saw greater virtue in collaborating with the war efforts for the benefits of Dalits, Jagjeevan Ram saw collaborating with Congress as enabling their cause. Both recognized the need for being part of the state, not being left out to share in the administration. In its project of creation of a separate labor portfolio and the appointment of a Dalit labor member, the colonial state reconfigured what Sabyasachi Bhattacharya calls the surrogate notion of interest representation by making it identity-based. In this conjuncture, the colonial state understood identities not merely as social identities, but also one with strategic interests. This paper has shown the adeptness of the colonial state in doing so during the war period. The post-colonial state did not contest or alter the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. So we'll now move on to our second speaker. So that's Dr. Srinonti Banerjee, who holds a PhD in politics from Birkbeck College, London, where she was a scholarship holder. Her PhD thesis is entitled The Governmentality of Population Debates in Postcolonial India. She has also taught at the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck. Her previous degrees include an MPhil at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta, a master's degree in Women's Studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Bombay, where she was the recipient of the Institute's Gold Medal and Best Student Award, and a bachelor's degree in sociology with film studies and journalism from St. Xavier's College, Calcutta. In October 2021, she will be joining the Unit of Global Justice at the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths College, London, as a postdoctoral fellow. Her paper is entitled Towards a Public History of Reproductive Justice, Platonian Care of the Self, the Anti-Colonial Force of Compassion, which is called Doya-Bol, and the Heterogeneity of Abortion Biopolitics in Postcolonial India. So over to you, Srinonti.
Thank you, Professor Guptu, for that introduction. Am I audible? I'm audible, right? This paper examines the public history of a key event in the trajectory of political modernity in post-colonial India, the moment of the legalization of abortion in 1971. It asks, in what ways did the rhetorical techniques of persuasion deployed in the parliamentary debates in the vernacular and in the writings of Indians, supposedly hyper-rationalist demographers, in relation to legalizing abortion, have the capacity to shape the world of political ideas? This presentation will largely focus on the parliamentary debates, while the full article studies the writings of Indian demographers as well. It shows the co-constitutive relationship between the apparently antithetical world of action and that of ideas by taking the specific case of the manifestation of the early Athenian, especially Platonian political idea of care of the self, as explicated by the French philosopher Michel Foucault in Indian Political Life. In the existing literature on Foucault, biopower and care of the self belong to two ideologically opposed schools of thought. If biopolitical governmentality, the mode of governmentality where life itself becomes a political concern, is identified as the culmination point of bourgeois modernity, the early Athenian idea of care of the self, the ethical actions via which the one who governs transforms oneself, undergoes subjectivation, and turns one's life itself into an oeuvre, is identified as the antithesis of such ubiquitous idioms of modernity. However, by using the case of abortion legalization in India, the paper will show how political actions punctuating the actual historical experiences of the governmental practices involved in bringing about political modernity in parts of the world whose umbrella term is not Europe, had undone the existing antithetical relationship between biopower and self-care. Abortion was legalized by the Indian state, as the feminist scholar Nivedita Menon reminds us, quite independent of the articulation of reproductive rights by the Indian women's movement. It was legalized as a health, humanitarian, and as a eugenic measure, ensuring that the woman has a right to abort only when she could provide evidence of the fact that she was impregnated due to rape, failure of contraception, or when the fetus was diagnosed with genetic abnormalities. Predicating abortion legalization on these series of conditions meant that the key question of the woman as a subject was erased. The existing literature has, for these very justified reasons, read the event of abortion legalization exclusively as a developmentalist measure of an aggressively modernizing state, gradually embracing capitalist development, geared mainly towards reducing human numbers, especially the abstract and often stigmatized surplus population. And I'm here thinking of scholars like Peter Sotoris, Nivedita Menon, Matthew Connelly, Shanton Roy, among others, Roy and Sotoris being the ones who explicitly identify the moment as biopolitical. The paper will point out both the necessity and the limitations of this, what I shall call a predominantly historicist literature. We can come back to the word historicism in the Q&A, by tracing epistemic heterogeneity in modern post-colonial practices of biopower. The primary objective of this paper is to demonstrate how, as opposed to the understanding of the current literature, a public history of this event will reveal that population control is a necessary but simultaneously an inadequate framework to analyze the governmentality involved in the moment of this legalization. Instead, I argue that the judicial and the political discourse on this issue often took recourse to a specific idiom of compassion towards the unfree and duped pregnant woman, victimized by masculine bad faith, as the historian Ranajit Guha, borrowing from Simone de Beauvoir, calls it, as the most crucial ground for passing the abortion bill in the Indian parliament. This concept of compassion, I suggest, was akin to two ideas apparently belonging to two distinct intellectual traditions at once. First, Mohandas Gandhi's anti-colonial analytic of Daya Bal, or the force of compassion, and second, Michel Foucault's idea of self-care or care of the self, drawn from early Athenian thought on political governance. A key yet hitherto neglected aspect of these parliamentary debates on abortion legalization that I thought was worth acknowledging was its crucial effort to repeatedly argue that the legalization of abortion should neither be identified as a part of the nation's developmentalist effort geared towards reducing human numbers, nor should the legalization be treated as a mere family planning measure, or even solely as a function of asserting reproductive rights. This was because, as the parliamentarians emphasized, the act of conceiving the legalization exclusively as either a population control or as a family planning initiative or as an aspect of rights undermines and diminishes the importance of acknowledging the state of victimhood that grounds the act of the pregnant woman seeking abortion. Instead, all these three gestures, as they argued, disingenuously constitute the pregnant woman in need of abortion as, on one hand, a sovereign sexual agent who is supposedly equally accountable for the unwanted pregnancy as the man, and, on the other hand, erroneously and often unjustly constitute abortion as a benign, willful, modern, mere contraceptive practice that women engage in. I'm here drawing some insights of Simone de Beauvoir. Now, a concluding crucial point, one rarely noticed, and one that I'm going to focus on in this presentation, was raised in the parliamentary debates and was related to this entire curiously consecrated effort of identifying the woman seeking abortion as a victim. The point was with regard to a tacit acknowledgement in these debates about the fact that it is literally impossible to be compassionate towards a pregnant woman through the mere act of identifying with her miseries and victimhood. In fact, one of the crucial grounds on which the law was legalized was predominantly one of what I shall denote as non-identification, or the impossibility of the spectator of suffering mastering or being one with the sufferer's misfortune. For instance, in the 1971 Lok Sabha debates, Nawal Kishore Singh of Muzaffarpur recognized that it is almost next to impossible for the doctor to fully comprehend if the woman, owing to her unwanted pregnancy, would suffer from mental anguish or mansik yantrana, as he calls it, or not. No doctor can say this, Singh notes. Furthermore, the bill mentioned that in order to determine whether the continuance of pregnancy would involve the risk of injury to the woman's mental health, the medical officials should make an account of the pregnant woman's actual or reasonably foreseeable environment. The MP, Mr. Singh, expresses severe discomfort with this legal vocabulary. The doctor himself notes, it's so very much mired in what Simone de Beauvoir would denote as a dubious male moral code that he will be incapable of making a decision on abortion or often end up making the wrong decision. This is because for Singh, the doctor will never be able to realize and know merely from statistical information and observable knowledge the full-blown implications that the legal phrase foreseeable environment might have for the woman. There in fact, Singh notes, might be several unforeseeable circumstances, that is, incalculable circumstances that cannot be reasonably anticipated or expected before they actually happen, which could then impel the woman to decide to abort. And even if the doctors seek to plan about the consequences of some of these unforeseen circumstances, he adds, something else will have happened. Social stigma, MP Ram Sahai Pandey further stresses, is a typical feature of modern rationalized societies, not primitive ones. He uses the English word rationalize in a speech that was otherwise delivered in Hindi. Pandey then expresses his concern with the following words, and I quote, after abortion, there is profuse bleeding. If you don't award these women, who will take care of them? In fact, time and again, we find such allusions in the Indian Parliament towards a bleeding female body and an idea of what can only be identified as man's epistemic non-access to the anguish of such bodies and minds. One of the best instances of this was the manner in which another member of Parliament, Dr. Mangla Devi Talwar, speaks of the deep anemia and general unconsciousness caused by botched illegal abortions. In all these discussions, what becomes gradually evident is that the parliamentarians acknowledged that male unholy conspiracy and irresponsible cruelty will often not let men know and master women's physical, social, and mental pain in its entirety. They seem to recognize that there will and must be an element of unknowability and unintelligibility in the very process of knowing that pain, a necessary unknowability that cannot be undone, conquered, and mastered by man. Man can therefore only act as a passive servant to the truth of this pain and never become its active master. Most crucially, compassion will be exhibited towards a woman, as the parliamentarians seem to argue, not in spite of, but precisely because of the supposed incapacitation that this unintelligibility and state of being a servant and not a master of the truth of female victimhood causes in the man. It is probably interesting to note here, as the literary scholar Shivaji Bandyopadhyay once reminded me, that in Shankho philosophy, a major pre-Vedic atheist Indian philosophy, accented upon two elements, human beings and nature, a man is described as being a nishkriyo udashin shakhi, aloof passive spectator. The biological male is conceived here as a mere witness of sorts to the whole cycle of childbirth and has no active role to the event. Here, birthing is not considered to be in the register of knowledge for the man. What is crucial in this for my argument is that while the modern statistical science of demographic control was premised upon a certain form of mastery of women's fertility by the science of modern obstetrics, then in order to legitimize itself, it had to take the help of abortion legalization, which, at least as we gather from some of these parliamentary debates, in some sense discredited this language of mastery and full comprehension of women's fertile bodies with the aid of modern medical personnel. Instead, it premised its credibility on a discourse of what Ranajit Guha calls a pre-experiential, non-humanizable idea of compassion, founded upon the aforementioned idea of a necessary non-identification or non-mastery. An idea of compassion that, most crucially, does not pedagogically tutor the woman to emancipate herself from the very ideology of shame that an unwanted pregnancy entails, and instruct her to thereby bring the pregnancy to term. This brings me to the second part of this paper that shows how this moment of abortion legalization directly resonated with a certain anti-colonial Gandhian idea of compassion or doya-bol. Now, in the history of politico-ethical thought in India, the concept of compassion or doya was not always pegged to the idea of identification, that is, the spectator of suffering becoming one with the sufferer. In fact, unlike, say, someone like Adam Smith's idea of sympathy, which is based on complete imaginative identification, based on reasoned judgment of the spectator of suffering with the sufferer or the governed, Mohandas Gandhi's notion of dayabal or the force of compassion has been distinctly about grounding the idea of compassion on this crucial concept of non-identification. In his formidable book Radical Equality, Ambedkar, Gandhi and the Risk of Democracy, the historian Aishwari Kumar has argued that for Gandhi, touching or approaching the Harijan or the untouchable within the Indian caste axis required a certain idea of economy, distance, or what Kumar calls the phenomenology of measure. To formulate it in different terms, it was based on the analytic of a necessary non-identification of the Brahmin or the one belonging to the upper caste with the untouchable. To approach this different, unequal other, the Harijan, who was the most violated, demanded a fortitude that, as Kumar provocatively tells us, was often and counterintuitively enough founded upon converting the act of discrimination itself into a political ideal. Despite Kumar's critique of Gandhi for contending that unlike the Brahmin who could become Harijan, the Harijan could never emulate or become the Brahmin, what is crucial to note is that even on an issue of untouchability, where Gandhi is arguably at his paternalistic best, the idea of compassion towards his violated Harijan was based precisely on an ethic of distance between the Brahmin and the Harijan, as Kumar calls it, and not on identification or sameness. The implication here is that becoming Harijan, just like becoming woman, for Gandhi was about two things. First, acknowledging that the truth or satya of the divinity of the Harijan suffering cannot be accessed unless the one who is aiming at gaining access to this suffering, that is the non-Harijan, sacrifices. Second, this act of sacrifice is fundamentally predicated upon acknowledging that gaining access to or knowing the truth force of the Harijan's divine suffering cannot be based on complete identification of the non-Harijan with the Harijan. It must involve what Skaria calls and Kumar explains to be a radically conservative process of both the Brahmin and the Harijan being dispossessed from their own selves. This radically non-sovereign gesture of becoming Harijan for Gandhi that often grounded his idea of the Abel or the force of compassion was the fulcrum of, as we know, his methodological insights on the anti-colonial political struggle. This brings me to the final section of the paper. Now, it will be a mistake to think that the act of grounding this force of compassion on non-identification was the sole prerogative of Indic tradition. In Plato's text Alcibiades, for example, on political governance in early Greek society, the notion of self-care or care of the self shared a remarkably similar apparatus of ideas with the aforementioned legacy of grounding compassion on non-identification. Self-care, as Michel Foucault had demonstrated, was predominantly about an unself-conscious acknowledgement that self-knowledge or wisdom, sophrosine in ancient Greek, was necessary for governing the individuals in the city-state in pre-Christian Athens. This self-knowledge, as was argued, was only possible when instead of learning about the truth of the object of governance's suffering, one engages in the difficult act of what Plato calls looking at the divine soul of the other. As Socrates explained in the text, this was structurally similar to how, in order to see or visualize oneself, one would generally look at the best part of the eye or the pupil of the other person. In the process, Plato acknowledged the necessary incompleteness or dispossession of the self-knowledge of the one who wishes to govern. The text centers around how the young aristocratic boy Alcibiades, destined to exercise political power and govern others, arrives at a realization that he has basically been duped by a structure of educational deficit prevalent in contemporary Athens, and the knowledge that he has accumulated over the years from his lovers, teachers, and kinsmen is both derisory and insufficient. Thus, admitting that one does not know or is ignorant both about oneself as well as the object of political governance, according to the text of Alcibiades, is the first and the most essential step involved in taking care of the self. Now, the key question that this paper asks is this: can the moment of exhibiting compassion towards a pregnant woman seeking abortion, until now constituted as a victim of masculine bad faith, whose pain and anguish has been suggested as something that is impossible for male doctors and male parliamentarians to empathize with, through the tools of comprehension and understanding alone, men who light the fire and stay away, be rethought as the care of the self moment, legitimizing, marking, and simultaneously haunting the modern liberal governmentality involved in the act of abortion legalization in India? Was there a tacit consensus? Was there a tacit consensus within the Indian Parliament especially amongst the male politicians, that acknowledging one's ignorance and the sheer incapacity to know the pain of the interpolated woman's body through the mechanism of identification would be one of the most effective ways of legitimizing abortion legalization, especially under social conditions where a large family was often considered as a social good. I wish to argue in the affirmative. The need to acknowledge the role that the man assumes by being a passive witness to the event of unwanted birthing was, I'd reckon, a valuable recognition within the parliamentary debates. Foucault notices that something strange has happened in the exposition of the text of the Alcibiades in the moment when the need to take care of oneself is introduced. This is the moment when Socrates is demonstrating to Alcibiades, the young motivated man keen to enter public life, how Alcibiades cannot appreciate the implication of the word harmony and therefore is unaware of how to govern the city-state. However, when he finds Alcibiades despairing to this, Socrates consoles him by saying, "But this is not serious, do not panic. After all, you're not 50, you're young and so you have time." But time for what? Foucault asks. The usual answer, he observes, would have been that since Alcibiades is young, he would have the required amount of time to learn to govern the city and the rhetoric required to exercise power. But as he further tells us, this is exactly what Socrates does not do. He does not equate taking care of oneself with acquiring the capacity to learn, develop oneself over a period of time, or acquire the know-how of efficient governance with time. Instead, Foucault observes that the masterstroke of the text of Alcibiades lies in the fact that at this stage, Socrates says to Alcibiades, "You're ignorant, but you're young, and so you have time not to learn, but to take care of yourself." Foucault immediately notes that a gap arises between learning and the need to take care of oneself, between what he then denotes as pedagogy understood as apprenticeship and this other form of culture, where a certain form of interplay between philosophy and spirituality in the ancient world is conceived. These are Foucault's words. An interplay that is grounded upon the aforementioned feminist analytic of a necessary epistemic unknowability. And my aim in this paper has been to show that this necessary unintelligibility directly speaks to the epistemic deficit involved in mastering the pregnant woman's pain, what Beauvoir would describe as the anguish of the manipulated and bleeding womb, those shreds of red life, that absence of a child, something that then evoked a certain sense of humility, modesty, and vulnerability in the male parliamentarians, a vulnerability that in turn was identified as a crucial ground for legalizing abortion. Tracing the history of this legal moment that primarily took place in the vernacular can thereby act as a key intervention within the field of political ideas, I argue, to the extent that it showed how the existing binary between biopolitics and care of the self is, in the final reckoning, not fixed. The boundary is, in fact, porous and permeable, where the latter, that is care of the self, often brought the former, that is the oppressive modernity that marked a certain kind of instrumental deployment of abortion legalization for a mere reduction of human numbers, into crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking. So we will now move on to the next speaker, and that's Blessy Chino Abraham. Blessy did her BA Honours in Economics and then an MA in History from St. Stephen's College in Delhi. She's currently a PhD student at the Department of History, University of Delhi. Her PhD thesis is titled Aspects of Indian Tariff Policy from the 1920s to the 1950s. She has presented papers at the University of Warwick, IIT, IIM, WIGH Harvard, and the University of Edinburgh. She was a visiting research student and Commonwealth Scholar at the University of Edinburgh. She was also a Charles Wallace Research Fellow at the British Library. She was awarded the ICHR's Junior Research Fellowship in 2018. She was recently awarded the short-term PhD DAAD Fellowship at CMIS in Göttingen. She has also taught various graduate-level courses in different colleges of Delhi University. Her paper is entitled Protection versus Preference, Behind the Scenes of Indian Tariff Board 1923 to 1931. So over to you, Blessy. You're muted. Bless you, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you for introducing me, ma'am. I'm very excited to present a part of my work at the Cambridge Political Intellectual History Workshop, and I'm excited to present a part of my research work here, and I look forward to your suggestions to further improve my work. And I've made some modifications to my original paper, which I shall highlight in my presentation, so please bear with me. I also would like to share my screen. I have a presentation. I'll just give me a minute. I just wanted to confirm if my presentation is visible to all. Is it visible?
Not yet. It is visible now.
Yes, it is visible. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to confirm that.
You might like to make it, the slide mode.
I did. Ma'am, is it visible now?
No,
In
it
full
is
slide
visible.
mode?
No, we can still see your slides on the left-hand side.
Okay.
Oh dear, it's not.
Okay. Okay. I'll just continue with the way it is because I'm not very technologically adept.
No, it's
So
just.
I'll just.
Bless you, I think what Professor Guptu was asking you to do is you open the PPT and then just start the
Yes.
slide. You hadn't started the
Okay.
slide. You had opened the PPT. Yes.
Should I? Okay. Is it
Yeah.
fine now? Okay.
I can't
Thank you.
actually.
Thank you.
Can
Okay.
others?
We can't
Um,
see yet. Just do
you
what you
can't.
did. Just do what you did last.
Can I just stick with the original premise that the site slides are available?
Yeah, let's go ahead with that. Let's go ahead with that. Fine.
Okay.
It isn't actually visible.
Yeah, now you still need to share your screen,
That's
Blessy. I
fine.
think you.
That's fine. Just
Yes.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So basically, my paper examines the recommendations from tariff board reports from the 1923 to 1931, and it examines how each of these recommendations were dissected, analyzed, modified, and finally reproduced to create an official policy that was an uncomfortable mixture of conflict, collaboration, and compromise. In studying the complex journey from tariff board suggestions to their reproduction as tariff protection acts, I choose to confront these many anxieties and expectations that were deeply embedded in these policy formulations. And through these, I also explore the idea of a multiverse of imagined capitalist futures shaped by fictional expectations and anxieties, and how the tariff board was a crucial part in not only fostering but also restricting these expectations. I also emphasize how this demonstrates the economic and political apprehensions of the British colonial government grappling with an ambiguous fiscal project of protectionism, preferential duties, and industrial planning in India in the 1920s. By extension, the back and forth on protection and preference also pointed to an anxious post-war empire struggling to ensure its hold on the market of its semi-autonomous colony that was constantly pushing towards fiscal independence and self-government. So we begin in the 1916 with the commencement of the First World War, which led to the Indian government raising the general import duties from 5% to 7.5% in order to meet India's debt obligations and to secure balanced budgets. General tariff rates were further increased to 11% in 1921 and to 15% in 1922 to meet the gap in revenues. This unintended protective effect of tariffs gave many enterprising Indian firms a necessary boost from the stimulus created by the war. However, despite these initiatives, it was also clear that this entrepreneurial enthusiasm could not survive without generous assistance from the government as they lacked proper technical knowledge and resources. This enthusiasm of Indian industrial enterprise was not new. There was the Swadeshi movement in 1905, which encouraged many young Indians to set up small scale industries. establishment of the Indian Industrial Conference since 1905, the fast industrial progress of Japan through heavy tariff protectionism, and the boycott of English goods during the non-cooperation movement initiated by Gandhi in the 1920s, by Gandhi in 1920. This boosted the imagined appeal of matching industrial development to community assertiveness and power among a growing group of Indians from comparatively affluent and literate backgrounds who had expectations of a new modern India that would act in its own interest and not be solely directed by the interests of the empire. Professor Brij Narayan, writing on Indian tariff in 1923, viewed the Swadeshi and non-cooperation movement as movements of voluntary protection given to home manufacturers in the absence of state intervention. He argued that the success of these movements showed that Indians were willing to make sacrifices to develop their own industries. It also nurtured the idea of a Swadeshi consumer alongside the Swadeshi manufacturer who would also sacrifice their present needs for an idealized imagined capitalist future where Indian interests remained foremost. Of course, till 1922, the Indian government continued to play down these demands for protection as anti-poor, anti-agriculture, and as a fantasy of few elite Indians. Indian government's assistance towards industrialization efforts began mainly with the setting up of the Indian Industrial Commission in 1916 and the Indian Munitions Board in 1917. Moreover, the appointment of the Industrial Commission was a signal to the public about the change in government policy regarding the Indian industry, which had earlier followed a policy of non-interference in the development of the private industrial sector of India. However, the Commission deliberately avoided any meaningful discussion on helping industries through protectionist duties. This policy of industrial planning on protectionist lines was not even a new one within the British Empire. Dominions such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa had followed similar protectionist policies since the mid 19th century in order to grow and nurture their industries. However, these countries had a modicum of political independence within the empire that allowed them to shape fiscal needs independent of interference from London. Therefore, it is not a surprise that demands for tariff protectionism shaped themselves into a bigger issue of self-government and fiscal autonomy. These demands only became more intense after the war. These demands were partially mollified through the introduction of the Government of India Act 1919, which included the Fiscal Autonomy Convention that stated that India's fiscal policy was mostly free and any interference of the Secretary of State would be minimal. However, it was approved only through an acknowledgement of an informal agreement that would give India some limited form of fiscal liberty similar to that of the UK and the Dominions. Then Secretary of State, Lord Montagu, was of the firm resolve that the office of the Secretary of State could only interfere in India's fiscal matters under exceptional circumstances in order to safeguard the international obligations of the empire. However, this interpretation of exceptional circumstances varied depending on who was in charge of the India office at a particular time. Montagu's successors, Lord Peel and then Lord Oliver, weren't as magnanimous about non-interference in Indian fiscal matters as their predecessor. They were often anxious about the extent of the fiscal liberty granted to India and frequently wished to exercise some degree of influence on the Indian government. This constant communication on tariff issues between the two offices governing India demonstrates a certain complexity that needed frequent negotiation and collaboration in structuring India's tariff policy in a way that not only appeased patriotic sentiments in India, but also imperial economic concerns such as preserving the share of British goods in the Indian market. It also demonstrated the Janus-faced characteristics of the Indian state that constantly adapted itself depending on the political and economic circumstances within and outside India. For instance, Montagu may have been in full favor of minimum interference from the India office in Indian fiscal matters, but he was also anxious to introduce imperial preference in India. He frequently wrote to the Indian government to portray preferential tariffs not as a concession for British goods, but to justify it on grounds of inter-imperial trade and imperial solidarity. He also suggested the immediate setting up of a tariff commission without delay in order to fulfill these purposes. In response, then Governor General of India, Lord Chelmsford, agreed with Montego on the establishment of a tariff commission, but suggested delaying its appointment as current political atmosphere in India was surcharged with racial feelings, with Gandhi's movement of boycotting British goods that had created much vitriol for British manufacturing interests in India, and the government was worried that the introduction of preferential duties would only antagonize the situation even more. Finally, on 7th October 1921, the Government of India approved the appointment of a fiscal commission to examine the appropriate fiscal policy for India, including the desirability of adopting the principle of imperial preference. However, by then it was already predetermined that India would follow some form of tariff that would serve protectionist and revenue needs. Moreover, it was clear that the message on the supposedly autonomous nature of India's fiscal policy had to be communicated in some way to the public. The Fiscal Commission interviewed mainly industrial and trading interests in India. The prevailing sentiments among the interviewees was that free trade had been imposed not in Indian interests but in the interests of British manufacturers, which seemed to reinforce the belief in tariff as a way to reclaim India's dying manufacturing industries and long gone economic prosperity. Though critical of protectionism as a panacea to Indian industrial woes, the Financial Commission's report justified a policy of protection to be applied with discrimination. That is, selective amount of protection for a fixed period of time given to industries that fulfill the following criteria. Firstly, said industry had easy and cheap access to necessary raw materials. Secondly, it could not survive without some form of protection. And lastly, the protection given would be temporary, and after the removal of tariff duties, the industry would be able to compete without any assistance. These later became the basis on which industries were judged eligible for protection by the Indian Tariff Board. Demonstrating the dual nature of Indian tariff policy, the report also studied the matter of imperial preference. The Commission concluded that India really did have very little to gain by granting preference to British goods, as she was already importing more than 60% of her goods from Britain. However, the Commission declared that the country was honor bound as a member of the empire to grant preference just like the way the Dominions did. Moreover, from 1919, Great Britain had also introduced preferential systems for many goods from the empire, including India. So India was obligated out of a spirit of gratitude and friendship to reciprocate through preference. Hence, adherence to this policy was also a test of loyalty for India, wherein various parts of the empire recognized their position as parts of a greater whole. Essentially, protection and preference were just opposite sides of the same coin, at least from the perspective of the imperial government in London. A minute of dissent was also attached to the report, which was presented by the Indian members of the Commission, including the President Sir Ibrahim Rahimtullah. Though this dissent was completely ignored by the government, it did register Indian frustration on the ambiguity on autonomy and the concept of discriminating protection. Much of these frustrations found their way to the Indian Legislative Council debates, where these concerns were brought to the forum frequently, highlighting the many discrepancies regarding the implementation of India's fiscal policy concerning tariffs and industries. Nevertheless, the Indian government accepted the Commission's compromise policy of discriminating tariff as a way towards industrial development, and the question of imperial preference was shelved for the time being. The proposals of the Indian Fiscal Commission finally came down to the appointment of the Indian Tariff Board, which to the government of India, initially was the most difficult and controversial recommendation made by the Commission. It was entirely opposed to the proposal of establishing a permanent Indian tariff board, independent and separate from the government. As a cautious compromise, it was decided to set up the tariff board for a period of 1 year and to decide whether to modify or abolish it completely. There would be 3 members appointed to the board. All of them would be appointed by the government and not the Legislative Assembly. On February 16, 1923, a resolution concerning the appointment of the Indian Tariff Board was passed by the Indian Legislative Assembly. The members appointed were G. Rainey as President, Professor B.G. Kale and P. Jinwala, who were also members of the Legislative Assembly. They had to quit their positions in order to join the board. And the first industry that they investigated was steel. Uh, the normal procedure for most of these tariff boards were that firms were requested to submit applications to the government of India, and from there, the Commerce Department of the government of India would select industries to be taken up for investigations by the tariff board. However, it is important to note that the board was only an advisory body to the government. Even the applications that reached the board for investigation were first vetted through the government, as mentioned earlier. Although by the end of the 1920s, the government had begun to rely more on the recommendations of the board, which it considered trustworthy, it did not necessarily imply that acceptance and publication of these proposals would result in their transformation into tariff law. Depending on the severity of economic circumstances, the political climate as a result of the pressure from the Indian legislature and the financial position of the government, protective policies on industries took many varied forms. This not only emphasized the Janus-faced characteristic of the Indian state, but also showcased how politically charged fiscal issues tended to be in India. The board investigated around 15 industries from 1923 to 1930. This rigorous nature of investigation and later publication of the tariff board results and evidence gave a reputation of honesty and efficiency of regarding the investigations of the board. It had also normalized tariff policy of discriminating protection. Throughout its tenure, the Indian Tariff Board recommended not just protective duties but also other forms of assistance such as bounties, removal of tariff inequalities, removal of revenue duties, dealt with dumping issues, and in one case even exposed a false claim by one of the applicants. Here I have I have made a small condensed version of all the tariff board reports and their recommendations, and these slides also show the government decisions based on these recommendations. As you can see, there are 15 industries, and they range from steel, cotton, cement, paper, coal, oil, magnesium chloride. And in my paper, I have gone into steel in detail, but here I'll be summarizing the general findings of the tariff boards and the decisions that were based on these recommendations. So coming back, yes. Sorry. Nevertheless, one can interpret the role of the tariff board through various industrial firms, through which various industrial firms in India could channel their expectations for protection as industrial assistance. Though the board had a reputation for being impartial in its investigation, out of 15 industries that it investigated, it only rejected the claims of 5 industries: magnesium chloride and cement in 1924, galvanized hardware in 1926, wire and wire nails in 1927, and oil in 1928. Magnesium chloride managed to get protection again, managed to justify its claim for protection in 1928. And oil was the industry which was made, where the applicant, the Burma Oil Company, made false claims, and the board rejected the appeal for protection. So, but I'll come to more controversial issues. Particularly interesting was when dumping was involved, chiefly in the case of steel, coal, and cotton. Often these issues split the board, especially on steel, Often these issues split the board, who were reluctant to impose countervailing duties or even differential duties to aid the industries in trouble. Much of this reluctance could be associated with imperial concerns regarding India's position as a primary good producer in the international markets and her favorable balance of trade with these countries. Moreover, both London and Delhi greatly feared retaliatory actions in response to anti-dumping duties. Surprisingly, in the case of steel, differential duties, which meant preferential access to British goods in Indian markets, were imposed in the Steel Industry Protection Act of 1927. Though the board did not call it preference, it was certainly a desperate attempt mirroring an anxious metropolis that feared the loss of its foothold in Indian markets to cheaper continental steel. And even when Indian industries were found eligible, suggested protective duties were far lower than what was demanded by the applicants. Often these duties were applied with the logic that it would allow the firms to just cover their costs of production with a very slight margin of profit. However, once these recommendations reached the government, they were further dissected through frequent memos and correspondences between the Governor General and the Secretary of State, often leading to the delay in publication of the tariff report and their eventual presentation in front of the Indian Legislative Assembly. The more serious the issue, the longer the government took to make up its mind. This also meant that the final tariff bill was mostly a diluted version of the board's suggestion and by extension a pale shadow of what applicants or the Indian members of the Legislative Assembly were expecting. This also demonstrates the cautious nature of the Indian state when dealing with tariffs, even when it was so heavily controlled. What is also noteworthy is that despite the reliance on the findings of the board, the Government of India never followed any fixed response to it. When the Tariff Board in 1924 suggested increasing duties for all categories of steel in order to counter the fall in price of steel imports due to the appreciation of the rupee, the government instead proposed bounties, arguing that it was cheaper and more effective way to help Indian steel industry. Similar was the case for cotton and salt. Particularly for cotton, the government was under increasing pressure from the Secretary of State and representations from Japanese cotton associations, and therefore extremely reluctant to increase tariff duty on cotton piece goods from 11 to 15%. However, the non-response from the government led to massive agitations by the Bombay Mill Owners Association and Indian cotton mills in other parts of the country, forcing the government to save face by passing the Cotton Yarn Amendment Act in 1927 that very slightly increased duties on all counts of cotton yarn. A brief look at these various instances allows us to draw some general conclusions. The Fiscal Autonomy Convention was one of those key agreements that continued to have ramifications on Indian tariff policy, up till the 1930s. This was particularly evident in the debate over preference and protection in India during the early 1920s and the eventual setup of the Indian Tariff Board. Pressure from London was always there monitoring the board. Pressure from the India office was always there monitoring the proceedings of the board and the government's response to their suggestions. Often the India office was the main force behind much of the dilutions of the tariff board recommendations. When the recommendations were finally presented as a bill to the Legislative Assembly and Council of State, these were filled with many contrary responses, sometimes critical of protection even. During the discussions of the Steel Industry Act of 1924, there were many Indian politicians who were suspicious of Tata's close proximity to the government of India and in fact interpreted protection as a tax to benefit capital and not labor. Interestingly, in the case of steel, the Indian government was heavily invested in its survival as it was afraid its failure would turn Indian opinion against it. And like in the case of cotton, there was also the involvement of public agitation by Indian firms forcing the government to backtrack. Therefore, the Indian government often dragged itself through various modifications of tariff bills, often at the expense of the original recommendations. so that it accommodated both empire economic anxieties as well as Indian legislature's aspirations for deciding in favor of Indian economic interests, which were fueled by nationalist imaginations about India's industrial potential. And looking through these various tariff board reports, as well as the decisions that were based on their recommendations, gives us a very varied picture of how policy making on tariff was a complicated political endeavor with lots of messy entanglements. Conflicting economic imaginaries about industrial modernity and fiscal autonomy continued to clash and negotiate through the workings of the tariff board in the 1920s. The Janus-based reality of the Government of India, clearly obvious in the way it utilized the board to circumvent and recreate fiscal policies that were not just based on economic concerns, but were also grounded in political realities, leads us to think of tariff policy as more than just an economic tool or ideology. In trying to understand the position of India within the larger framework of the empire, it forces us to confront a politico-economic space of constant anxiety and of aspirational imaginaries that was so frequently contested and often split into various opposing binaries of preference and protection, imperial and national, industrial and agriculture, that it often led to frequent reimaginings of various kinds of capitalist futures based on the fiscal expectations of protection, preference, development, and propagation of inter-empire trade and solidarity. This multiverse of capitalist futures were modeled on the politics of these fictional expectations and can then be seen as interpretative frames through which we understand these imaginaries created as a result of the complex engagement on the issues of tariff policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting indeed. So we swiftly move on to the next speaker, as I think we are running a bit behind time. So our next speaker is, sorry, did somebody say something? Or no, it was just a noise. Okay. Our next speaker is Professor Wendy Singer. She's the Roy T. Wertman Professor of History and Director of Asian and Middle East Studies at Kenyon College in the US, where she teaches modern Indian history and comparative Asian studies. Her books include A Constituency Suitable for Ladies, a very well-known and well-regarded book, which is a social history of women and elections, and Independent India, which tells history through literature, art, politics, and social movements. Her earlier work was on oral narratives and rural politics in Bihar, as reflected in her book, Creating Histories. She has extended her study of elections now to the policy of reservations and affirmative action, and how this plays out in the governing bodies, in such governing bodies as municipalities and parliaments and everything in between. And this work has taken her to Madras and focused a lens on the history, and some of this recent research has appeared in the Journal of South Asia, the Election Law Journal, and will be published in a forthcoming new book on language politics. Over to you, Wendy. The title of the paper is Democracy as Resistance, Representing the Margins in the Madras Municipal Council 1920 to 1935.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. There it is. Share. Did that work? Great. Okay, thank you, Nandini. It's so lovely to see you for chairing this panel, and Rohit for everything, not just being a discussant on this panel, and all my fellow panelists, plus the excellent presenters yesterday. This is a new direction in research for me, both methodologically and in this case, the case of this paper, geographically. I'm usually an historian of Bihar, and have approached Madras for a critical comparison. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to present new work, and I really enjoyed learning about some new directions in history. There's some really useful interactions, I think, even on this panel that I hope we get to talk about later. So let me talk a little bit about the water van case, or the watering truck case in Madras. Story 1. On 19 January 1932, Chakkarai Chettiar, the chair of the Works Committee of the Madras Municipal Council, was passing by the Flower Bazaar police station with a group of colleagues when he noticed a watering truck belonging to the Municipal Council parked in the police compound. At the next council meeting, he demanded that the police return it. Indeed, he called for the commissioner, a British officer, to come explain to the council why the police were in the possession of a municipal corporation property. Indeed, he called the meeting adjourned to await the commissioner. When he arrived, Commissioner D.D. Warren reported that the police had taken the van for safekeeping. At this, there was an uproar. Hanan Angelo, the only woman on the council, asked the commissioner, did he know the purpose of a watering truck? The commissioner acknowledged that he was, indeed, he understood the use of it for watering the streets in times of heat or in flushing out drains. So, she asked, when the council wants to use the truck for the purposes for which it was purchased, how do we reclaim it? Do we impound it? Do we write a letter? Do we make a telephone call? Other members of the council laughed at the ironic nature of her question because while the council did own the truck, it did not have the power to make demands of the police, which were under direct British jurisdiction. Story 2. Times of India, Dateline Madras, 16 January 1932. Police rounded up and dispersed Congress volunteers who resumed picketing of foreign cloth shops in the Ratan Bazaar, Madras, on Friday evening. It is reported the volunteers put on raincoats to prevent their being drenched through water hoses used by the police. The watering truck incident, which first appeared in the municipal council debates as a claim of property rights by the municipal government, also reveals council members' concern over police response to nationalist protests. The newspaper report demonstrates how the police had used the watering truck to spray protesters and disperse crowds. As a result, the incident as a whole illustrates the ironies of having a representative government in a colonial setting. Indians, along with the British, were members of the City Council of the Madras Corporation, which is the oldest continuing municipal corporation in India. By 1932, the council met twice a month and carried out the business of city services, including sanitation, healthcare, and schools, and acquired and maintained corporate equipment such as watering trucks. But in a colonial state, of course, council did not control the police. This incident, in which the British bureaucracy part of the government ran into conflict with the representative part of the government, reveals the inherent fissures within the administration of Madras Corporation. And members' decisions frequently had to take into account these contradictions. And the diversity of the council assured that not all members shared the same political commitments. I am interested in this complicated gray area where the roles of different kinds of institutions intersect or jostled uncomfortably. This essay uses the watering truck incident not only for its historical significance suggested above, but also for what it tells about the development of democratic institutions and how it tells history. Therefore, I focus here on the archive as well. Seeing history through the lens of the municipal council debates, and especially from the question and answer periods with government officials, opens up new historical inquiries. What did it mean to practice democracy in a colonial system and against a colonial system at the same time? How did the municipal corporation function and change in the early 20th century? How did people of different social status, religious affiliation, and linguistic backgrounds interact within a fluid political structure? Through the written record of members of the council, I came to learn about their relationships with one another and their and the diverse way and the relationships with the British government of Madras as well as with their constituents. This study has larger implications as well for understanding institutions, how institutions function with embedded inequalities, showing how sometimes forces of democracy, even in an undemocratic state, provide tools for resisting racism, classism, casteism, and patriarchy. Studying the Madras Municipal Council. The research for this paper comes out of a larger project on the history of reservations, particularly as they evolved in governing bodies. I was looking for the origin of this political idea, and Madras was a logical place to start because Madras has been practicing something like reservations, particularly for non-Brahmins and depressed classes, since 1920. In 1932, members of the municipal council saw themselves as representing complex sets of constituents based on their own experience, expertise, ward of the city they represented, and reserved category or other self-defined identity groups. The council was also diverse in other ways. It included British members, Indian members who associated themselves with the British government of India and voted with the British, as well as open nationalists who themselves had different ideas of nationalism. And we had an earlier paper that talked about the Periyar group. The records of the municipal corporation are held in an archive in the Ripon building built in 1916, where the municipal council still meets. I also observed the municipal council in its current incarnation. And the record room, which was around the back of the building, was a working archive not intended for researchers, but rather where current government officials might go to get information on earlier actions of the council and its regulations. For my part, having gone through several days of inquiries within the official bureaucracy, I had finally gained permission to use the materials by making a formal request to the city commissioner, the IAS officer, whose British predecessor in 1932, D.D. Warren, was one of the antagonists of the watering truck story. The records from the early part of the 20th century were not particularly in order. They'd been rescued some time back from a flood, and my needs were, reasonably enough, not a high priority. So it took a week or so for relevant documents to emerge. Therefore, the first volume of the municipal council debates that appeared on my table was, in fact, the proceedings of 1932. The watering truck incident became my first encounter with the workings of the Madras Municipal Council and served as an introduction to its members, including Chakkarai Chettiar, Hanan Angelo, as well as others, Shiv Shanmughan Pillai and Bashir Ahmed Saeed, whose careers and interactions I then followed across 2 decades and who became the center of my research. Other scholars have written about each of these figures, for example, M.S.S. Pandian on Chakkarai Chettiar and S. Anandi on Hanan Angelo, though in other contexts. Here I want to place them and their relationship in the context of the municipal council in which they served. In Chennai, I spent more time with Chettiar, Angelo, Saeed, and Pillai than most contemporary people. My days were filled with their conversations, conflicts, and negotiations. Starting in 1932 was fortuitous. It was an important year, the heart of the civil disobedience movement. I was also moving back and forth between other sources, such as newspapers, including Kudi Arasu, Periyar's newspaper, which was available in the library just about a mile away, and other English, Tamil, and Telugu press. Headlines from the January 1932 report: police use water hoses to clear pickets, Madras procession dispersed, women arrested, and Qadr-clad Scot arrested in Madras. The latter story revealed that a clergyman, Dr. F. Payton, who had established a Christian ashram outside Madras, was one of those arrested at the Ratan Bazaar, the same place that the watering truck incident took place. The editor of Andhra Patrika, the Telugu language newspaper, was also arrested the same day. In Madras, a picture emerged of weekly picketing in Ratana Bazaar. which was in Chakkarai Chettiar's constituency. So he didn't just happen to be walking by the police station, as he said when he walked into council. Nearly 200 citizens of Madras, including several members of the legislature, have formed the Buy India League, the newspaper reported. The League's activities will be non-political in character. The question of whether or not Swadeshi advocacy was indeed non-political arose in council debates. For example, on the very same day that Chakkarai Chettiar raised the concern over the watering truck incident, several members proposed the council provide rupees 750 for financial support for a Swadeshi exhibition. Others, notably Ranganathan Chetty and Sundarrao Naidu, objected on the grounds that some of the people involved in the exposition were members of the Indian National Congress, and therefore it was a political event which the government should not endorse. To this, a member of the council who supported funding the exhibition responded in a way that demonstrated the fine line between the meaning of council and the meaning of government. I am not in a position to understand the fear of my friends, Mr. Ranganathan Chetty and Mr. Sundarrao Naidu. We are not employees of the government, and we are not in any way subordinate to the government. We are a premier corporation. We are independent men, and as a whole body, we can do everything and anything without the consent of the government. The circumstances of the Swadeshi exhibition required that the members of council stake their positions between government and nationalist organizations. Sundarrao Naidu often spoke as if the council had two sides, our side versus their side, meaning the nationalists. The conclusion of the debate came with a compromise proposed by British council member F.E. James, who suggested that the council wait until the Swadeshi exhibition had closed its books to be sure that it needed the funds. In other words, he dodged the question. In thinking about these interactions between different institutions in Madras, I'm drawn to the idea of democracy as practice, the development of institutions through everyday acts of governance. Following in Amartya Sen's argument in Finding Indigenous Practices in India that shape Indian democracy, I see the members of the Madras Municipal Council as constructing their own democratic rituals, rules, and affecting change. In another article drawn from the same material just published in the journal South Asia, I show how women members created rules for interactions to counter harassment they experienced in early Indian legislatures and thus developed grievance procedures, in some cases for the very first time. In other words, patterns of interaction between members became institutionalized as representatives needed new rules and citizens needed more services. Through the actions of individuals in the Madras Municipal Council, I'm encouraged to rethink the structure of the council itself and how acts of governing built and rebuilt it. Not only do the debates constantly bring to the fore questions about circumscribed power of the council, but also there is a fluidity of who attended council meetings and how they used its various avenues of power. Let us return to the watering ban. In this context, Chakkarai Chettiar calls the police commissioner to return the watering ban, also evoked nationalist sentiments. Yet his strategy changed the direction of the debate, away from the dichotomy of nationalists versus British government to focus on the municipal corporation's property rights and the integrity and autonomy of the council itself. The council had the power to demand Commissioner Warren's presence, and it ultimately demanded the return of the watering truck. Significantly, support for this position came not only from members associated with nationalist views, but from their usual opponents as well. Further, the debate on the watering truck incident also showed the wit, oratorical skill, and detailed concerns of council members. At one point, Bashir Ahmed Saeed mocked the police commissioner's offer to reimburse the council's cost, even granting that it is prepared to pay the cost of water used. What is the rate at which he is to be charged? If, for instance, the commissioner of police does not use this water, he may be entitled to use other water, perhaps gutter water. Even gutter water is also ours. Besides, the use of gutter water will be against the provisions set out by the health officer. To this, an unnamed voice yells, he will use the water of the Kovam, regarding to the known to be polluted river. Saeed did not miss a beat. I have no objection to his using the water of the Kovum, but any use of unhealthy water should be put to the health commissioner. And later, when a member sympathetic to the commissioner, Sami Venkatachalam Chetty, suggested that he was of the opinion that the use of the water hose against picketers and mobs is a much more humane method than using lathis against them, Hanan Angelo bit back, announcing that a woman fainted as a result of the use of the water hose. In a flurry at the end of the debate, Chakrai Chettiar summed up the argument. I do not believe in making any compromise between one kind of inhumanity and another. My sense of right and wrong is not so subtle as that. If you call on me to make an observation, I believe that both these methods, the use of a lathi and the use of a water hose, are on poor defenseless ladies. Both are not unchivalrous, but barbarous and unworthy of any civilized government. If one challenges this contention, I will ask him to brave a public audience and indicate his position. In so doing, he appealed to the idea of a civilized government and to a common political trope, the protection of women. However, most striking here is that he did so with the powerful language that, as in many other moments, swayed his fellow council members. With what this example illustrates, and I have other examples as well, is that the Municipal Council in Madras was an assertive political body that claimed an apolitical nature. In the process, it established a noonday meal program for poor children. It asserted the rights of children from depressed classes, the term used for Dalits, to gain an education. And on September 23rd, 1931, the council debated the use of different languages for the development of nationalist songs. It is too complicated a discussion to address here, but some of the key issues that arose were in what language would the songs be sung, Telugu, Tamil, Urdu, and whether or not the songs would have a religious content. And all of that required a great deal of nuanced and discussion. Also, for the sake of discussion, the songs had to be cross-translated so that the members could read them all. This mirrored debates in the council that had taken place earlier about in what language would they speak. In addition, there was a discussion of the objectionable phrases in some songs, for instance, to refer to Dalits. The character of the council debates highlighted the diversity of its members. On other occasions, the council considered naming neighborhoods, streets, and parks, using their authority to imprint the landscape with the values they advocated. For example, in August 1938, a council member proposed naming a park after a Dalit statesman, V.G. Vasudeva Pillai, who was a former member of council. P.M. Valayadapani, who championed the proposal.
You have a minute. Could you try and conclude now?
Yeah, I'm just about at the end. Who championed the proposal, also was of Dalit background and claimed this would be the first park honoring a person of depressed class. Conclusions. In one direct reading of the incident of the watering truck, illustrates the uneasy relationship between nationalist actors and institutional roles they came to fill. However, looking more closely at the individuals in the Madras Municipal Council, the story also shows the fluidity of the council itself. It took on changing roles in Madras. It brought different kinds of people into the institution. And those individuals began to work with one another in complex ways. The members of the Madras Municipal Council in their everyday work, even as they walked down the street and saw a watering truck in the police compound, created intersecting histories that challenged our understanding of colonialism, democracy, and Dalit politics. Finally, let me address what happened in the watering van case. Chakrai Chettiar proposed a resolution that said that the government could no longer take watering vans without permission. He concluded by acknowledging his particular positionality as a non-Brahmin politician. Now I represent a strong non-Brahmin division, and wherever I go in that division, people laugh at me and say, "What are you doing in the corporation? We have not sent you to play second fiddle to the Commissioner of Police or the government of Madras. I must say this. When the occasion comes of the government ill-treating the people of our country, I must stand on the side of the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That was fascinating. I would like to invite Rohit now to offer his comments on the 4 papers as the discussant. And just to introduce Rohit, he began his doctoral research at Cambridge after completing his MPhil in modern history from JNU. Before that, he had first-class degrees, BA and MA degrees from Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and then another MA from Delhi University. He's the recipient of the Cambridge Trust PhD scholarship, and in his doctoral project, he's looking at the emergence of the academic discipline of history in 20th century India. He's interested in how the everyday political informs intellectual exchanges, electoral formulations, identity formation, and governmentality. So over to you, Rohit. We seem to have somehow managed time really badly. So there's very little time left. And I have to leave at 2 myself because I have another meeting. So I apologize in case I have to slip out quietly in the middle of things. And Rohit can then carry on for a little bit if we do have a lot of questions. So over to you, Rohit.
Thank you. I'll keep this brief because you'll have to leave, so I'll keep it brief so that you can come in with your comments and then responses and questions can come in later. I'm not going to comment directly on the extensive research and the themes done on the paper because I'm also the organizer. So I constantly at the back of my head when I was reading these papers, I was thinking of how these can be interpreted from the ideas of the everyday political, from the ideas of the decanonical and so on. And my comments, I'll not read out all of them, would be in light of this. So I'll begin with Shivangi's paper. I'm guessing Shivangi can hear me. She was having some problems. So Shivangi, it's a fascinating extension of Professor Shobbhashati Bhattacharya's work on the surrogate notion of interest representation, the GOI Act 1935 and the priorities of war and Indianization of DC and all of that. I think one very good thing that comes out of your work is it can be linked together with the kind of work I'm reminded of Wendy Webster's work, actually mixing it diversity in the World War and in World War II Britain. So there's a lot of work now happening in England as well on how the wars pushed England more from an isolationist perspective towards a sort of diversity kind of a perspective. So that's one. I find the rhetoric of loyalism employed by Ambedkar, which you cite, very fascinating. For me, one of the key takeaways for your paper, and this is both with my discussant and my organizer hat on, is that the machinations which were taking place between establishing establishing legitimacy between Ambedkar and Jagjeevan Ram, So this actually speaks to the theme of our conference as well, our workshop, where Ambedkar studies essentially has done a lot and achieved a lot over the last few years, but Jagjeevan Ram, since a lot of the scholarship around him has been in the vernacular, has sort of suffered. And I think your work in exploring a large part of that in the latter half of the paper can actually be developed to deal with questions of visibility, questions of access, and questions of the canon on how these two stalwarts of Dalit politics, when they were influencing both the Indianized War Council, the Executive Council, and later day post-colonial politics, on their sort of afterlife, if you will. And also, I would stretch your argument of the paper on the debates between Jagjeevan Ram and Ambedkar, maybe after Professor Gupta's comments, if you want to come in, on how you see their differences in light of the everyday political today and the real politics today, when Dalit Bahujan Muslim Alliance is being spoken of as a counter to right-wing populism. But there is also an increasing understanding that maybe Ambedkar, as we also see in your paper, was in a sense more essentialist in his battles. He was thinking of the Dalits as representatives, and which was also explained by his collaboration with the British. So how do you see this idea of an emerging alliance as a counter to right-wing populism? So I have restrained from commenting on the part of the paper because that will become extensive. I'm leaving out those comments. Let me now come to Wendy's paper again. Wendy, thank you. It was a fascinating paper on the uneasy relationship between nationalist actors and the institutional roles they came to fulfill. Might I sort of try and, make you think in the direction when you're already speaking about the delicate negotiations that were taking place in the Madras Municipal Council and whether to support the Swadeshi and yet how to remain loyal to the British government, maybe thinking of the phenomena of decolonization. When we think of decolonization today, we are essentially thinking in curricular formations, thinking in those terms, but what of the phenomena of decolonization under colonization itself? I mean, how can we rethink, the nuances of colonization through individual actors or through institutions or through the negotiations that you highlight in your work? How can we think of decolonization and negotiations through that? So that is, maybe I'll just want to take you in that direction and think again, because it sort of ties up with the broader theme of our workshop. And Srinonti, I think Srinonti is there. So I'll also, Srinonti, a wonderful paper. In fact, I won't like to cut short on some of the comments for your paper because I found them very engaging on a different note, actually. So Daya Ball. So I was just thinking, could it be employed in, let's say, a Gandhian sense of duty, whereby compassion becomes, maybe impersonal. Compassion becomes impersonal or is seen as duty, perhaps deracinated from compassionate action, where duty becomes the crux of it. Perhaps that was it, because you were also talking about how Gandhian thought could, we envision Daya Ball and seeing the Daya Ball in Gandhian life. And if you think of this sense of duty, which is very important to Gandhi, because Gandhi, was also sort of an anti-textualist, more of an experiential thinker. So when you think of the sense of duty, could the legislation itself, which sort of sets aside the agency of women and takes upon itself the savior hat, could the legislation be then seen in this light? The sense of duty may be deracinated from, compassionate action. And also, I really like the contrast between Chandrasekhar's views on the ideal and the, permissibility when it comes to the two segregations and its contrast with the Catholic laws. Here is where I was again going back to Gandhi and, Gandhi's brahmacharya, and you highlight that in your paper, comes through experiential knowledge, right? So if Gandhi's brahmacharya is presented as an ideal for people to adopt merely as textual, would it be a sort of, adulatory or emulatory possibility? Would it even be in the realm of possibility? Because Gandhi, as we all know, himself talks about, how his own realization comes when he was pursuing his carnal desires while his father lay in the deathbed in the other room. So, for Gandhi, all of this knowledge, his own philosophy is evolving through experiential, understanding. Gandhi at times could be a very anti-textual thinker, because when Gandhi is confronted with criticism about what is there in, Sanatani Dharma as he sees it, then he corrects himself and says, well, if this is there, I don't agree with it. So maybe if you could think through experiential knowledge, the idea that I spoke about, and then could the idea of Daya Ball as duty feature in your thinking of how this legislation was pushed ahead? I'll keep it to that now and not read out the rest, maybe come back to it later, post a few questions. And as for Blessy again, fascinating paper. I don't know whether Professor Guptu is in any way related to the Phanindra Guptus of the Chorna fountain pen. I don't know, but those were the era when the Swadeshi enterprise, as you rightly pointed out, the Swadeshi entrepreneurs suffered a terrible fate because this wartime protectionism hadn't yet come into play. So there was still a preferential treatment for the Scottish lords, if you will, who had the manufacturing in India, and the Swadeshi entrepreneurs did suffer. And the time that you are looking at from the protectionism, many of the national bourgeoisie benefit. My only sort of suggestion is, and because I work on a later phase, but I work on sugar and sugar tariff and sugar policy in post-colonial India, it's a research interest of mine. I was wondering would it be worthwhile? I mean, I understand you do talk about Tata Steel lobbying and all that is happening behind the boardroom, but would it be worthwhile to look at some of the native press and how these machinations are being received in the native press, how they think of these tariff board decisions and so on? Because, of course, some native press was owned by the large trustees and the large national bourgeoisie families and so on. But what of the native press, which had a nationalist and middle class ownership? How do they look at things? Did they see this many of these policies as not being right for the consumer, like maybe Rabindranath's own critique of Swadeshi later? So maybe the native press might give you a more nuanced picture of the reception of the tariff policies and so on. So I'll end there, and maybe you can come in with your comments later, but I'll give the mic back to Professor Gupti for her.
Thanks very much for those comments, Rohit. And in view of the time, I will be very quick. And really, I have various questions for each of you, but I think I will not ask those, but rather try to say a few things about the things arising from the concerns of this workshop, which is to do with new ways of doing intellectual history. And I think these 4 papers are incredibly interesting because we have been to arenas that are very familiar in the historiography of imperial and colonial history. We're looking at legislatures and similar other governmental institutions, but in fact, you're looking at them very differently. And rather than looking at interests or interest group competition, or even from the intellectual history perspective, overt ideologies and ideas that are expressed as such, you're unpacking practices, procedures, and debates in order to understand how various intellectual ideas are expressed in other forms. So really going along with Rohit's preoccupation about everyday politics and such things as everyday social relations, rituals, and so on that are expressed in these arenas, and how we can look at those to think about intellectual history. And it's from that perspective, I think I found all these papers have something in common, at least methodologically and analytically, and how each of them kind of expand the possibilities of intellectual history. So, clearly the first paper did this very well. We've always thought about everything that goes on in Viceroy's councils in terms of interests and balancing imperial interest versus nationalist interest and various kinds of competing national interests. But now we see in very clear ways how we ought to reinterpret that in terms of not just identities, which is the point you made, but how underlying those identities are particular kinds of political ideas and ideologies. What was the next one? The next paper was Srinonti's, wasn't it? Yes. Yes, that was a very, very interesting paper indeed, and a very interesting way of bringing ideas from outside of the legislative arena to try to understand what was going on there. I do have a question for Srinonti, not least because this is something that I've been interested in and working on. You present the legislation largely as being masculine, male, patriarchal, or at the very least paternalistic in its character, which clearly it is, and most legislation, one would argue, is probably that, even in this day and age. The people you quoted, I imagine, were all men. I was wondering whether there were any women's voices and what those were, and how those might have been appropriated. We know Gandhi was the practitioner par excellence of appropriating feminine virtues and characteristics. So I wondered whether the language of compassion and so on, how far, and indeed of victimhood, how far those might have been appropriated from the voices of women participants in this debate, either within the legislative arena or outside in newspapers, activist circles, and so on. So that was a question I was curious about. The third paper was protectionism. Again, I found that really very interesting, that you were thinking about these wider imaginaries that underpin legislative debates. I was slightly disappointed in the end that you didn't tell us a bit more about those competing imaginaries, and something that she put very nicely, aspirational economic imaginaries. The colonial state, I don't know whether it was more aspirational, less aspirational than trying to retain control, but nevertheless, on the other side, clearly there were competing aspirational imaginaries of various constituencies. And I think Rohit was hinting at that when he was talking about wider newspapers. And it would be nicer to, I mean, obviously you had, didn't have enough time to go into that. Finally, One Newspaper, of course, is a wonderful kind of example of how all these various forms of everyday politics come together and take shape within the institutional arena, but are always talking to everything outside. And this is not just of a question of how the outside frames the inside, but rather how they're constantly interpolating and shaping each other. And so I thought, this has been a really rewarding experience of seeing how intellectual history should be done, intellectual history Mark II in your generation should be done kind of going forward in the future. And so thank you very much indeed for this very stimulating session. And I'm really sorry, I really would like to stay, but I haven't kind of bargained for going over time, and I have another meeting, so I'll have to quietly sleep out in a few minutes.
It's okay. It's okay. Thank you, Professor Gupta, for your time, and I'm sure the presenters are equally grateful for finding time for the comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you?
Sorry, no, I'm just kind of going to be, because I'm going to sleep out, I'll hand over to you, Rohit, to run the Q&A, perhaps starting with some responses from the speaker.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Gupta, once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll continue from there. Would any of you want to respond to Professor Gupta's comments and maybe just a few of the suggestions that I made, and then we'll open it up for other questions.
Yeah, I can begin, with Rohit's point about the idea of duty. I thought, that was a very interesting point in the sense that certainly, Gandhi would certainly be emphasizing on the idea of universalizing the idea of duty. But I'd kind of, differ in terms of saying that it is not really impersonal duty. Because, that's one of the things that I'd, at least, it's like work in progress, and I want to kind of, emphasize on that particular point. Because, impersonal duty is something which the mainstream liberal tradition is wanting to emphasize upon. And, if you look at Adam Smith's work in the theory of moral sentiments, that's one of the points that he talks about. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum kind of picks up on that very idea of an idea of duty that is impersonal. I think Gandhi is saying something slightly different. And that's something which I thought kind of played out in the legislation, because he is talking about universalizing not in certain idea of duty as impersonality, but duty as sacrifice. So he wants to universalize the idea of the family, and here sacrifice would mean the whole idea of male parliamentarians acknowledging and wanting to emphasize upon the fact that you cannot really have access to women's pain, the pregnant woman's pain and anguish, merely by identification or merely by the category of imagining their pain. That's one of the things that I wanted to briefly mention. On the idea of experience here, I think that's very important in terms of the binary that you build between textual texts and experience. I think that's very well taken. But nonetheless, what I wanted to do in the paper was literally think about this. When I say the idea of the pre-experiential, I'm thinking about Ranajit Guho's this whole category about when he talks about an idea of doya, which cannot. So he talks about something which is beyond the realm of he says bodhogambhota, which roughly translates as perceptibility, perception. So I think that what I'm trying to say beyond experience is that I'm talking about beyond men's experiences, male doctors and male parliamentarians. So that's very briefly, thinking about what I mean by the category pre-experiential. On Professor Gupta's question about, female voices within the legislation, I think yes, very much, because I talk about this particular MP called Mangla Devi Talwar, who talks about, botched illegal abortions and this whole idea about, what about the female body, which is, suffering from deep anemia, and the male parliamentarians pick up on that point. That's something, again, I've not been able to kind of literally tease out, but the male parliamentarians pick up on that point And the idea of non-identification, I think, is very much built on, that one female voice, which I reckoned and recognized. And I love to kind of build the So I think that roughly sums it up.
Would Shivangi, would you want to go next?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Rohit, and thank you, Professor Gupta, for your comments and questions on the paper. Rohit, thank you very much for drawing my attention to Wendy Webster's work on World War II in Britain and how the question of diversity. I will certainly look at this work with reference to my project. Regarding Ambedkar and Jagjeevan Ram, so my doctoral thesis is a comparison of Ambedkar and Jagjeevan Ram as labor ministers. So the thesis looks at them as labor ministers besides being Dalit politicians. So this paper tried to show the context and the political trends both nationally and internationally, which made their appointments possible. Rather than assuming that Ambedkar and Jagjeevan Ram were appointed as labor ministers just by the fact of being Dalits or in their politics in 1930s, which brought in labor and caste together, as we can see in Ambedkar's case with Independent Labour Party, and with Jagjeevan Ram's case we see with Khetihar Mazdoor Sabha. So my thesis draws this parallel between Ambedkar and Jagjeevan Ram throughout the 30s into the 40s, and the difference we see in the 1930s when we see interesting parallels between them on the question of labor in the 1940s. So despite their different approaches to the question of caste, we see interesting parallels between them when it came to labor question. So this paper tried to show the historical context of the Executive Council, the Second World War, the post-war period, when they were appointed as ministers, labor ministers. And in fact, there was one newspaper clipping where Ambedkar said that he wished he was appointed as labor minister again, but the Congress chose to replace him with Jagjeevan Ram and appointed the portfolio of law to Ambedkar. Coming to the links with the present politics is something which I am currently working on. So with linking both Ambedkar's and Jagjeevan Ram's politics, and also to look at, my thesis looks at their career as labor ministers between the decade between 1942 and 52. I am extending this work to look at their entire political career to see the shifts in their opinion on labor and caste and the relationship between them. Coming to Professor Gupta's comment, I'm really thankful to her for her comments. And yes, this paper is trying to look at Executive Council in detail, in the sense that so far we have the existing literature has looked at Executive Council as an administrative measure or as a political institution, so to say. But this project is trying to bring in the question of identity representation within the Executive Council, and how Executive Council became a space for the question of representation and parity against the backdrop of the war, and to look at the politics of Ambedkar and Jagjeevan Ram within the Executive Council. So to look at their politics, in Executive Council, to look at EC as the site of politics for these politicians of Dalit origins. Thank you very much.
Hi, Rohit. Thank you for the feedback, and also to Dr. Nandini Gupta for her feedback. This idea of this aspirational, competing imaginaries. I know that my paper lacks a bit in terms of understanding native opinion a little more. One of the things is that most of the sources for this particular paper have been sourced from British Library records. So most of the new press cuttings that I did encounter were from, the English press, or in these commercial press journals like Capital, the Textile, the Status, the Times, the Textile Machinery, the Manchester Guardian. So I do know that my paper was a little biased in that direction. But also, I'll say one of the biggest problems is, I might say, because of COVID, fieldwork, especially, I mean, accessing private archives that, say Tata Central Archives or the Birla Archives, has been particularly very difficult. In order to glean these native opinions, have been a bit of a struggle. So one of my fallback has been to depend on the legislative debates that happen. So though I know most of the native opinion is represented by the legislative debate, and that is a very narrow, but I also think that they do present a very good enriched, version, or a good, they let you, you get to hear these voices of these affluent bourgeois classes who have these strong capitalist visions, but they are pretty contrasting. They themselves cannot agree within themselves, because most of these debates are like pages long, and my attempt in this particular scenario has been to focus more on them, and assuming that once things get a bit normal, I would like to go and supplement my research with a little bit of more access to native newspapers as well as private business archives. I hope that it's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to see if other people have questions. And Rohit, if you had other feedback, if you wanted to email it, that would be really awesome. And I very much appreciate your the idea about using the theoretical frame of decolonization. I was looking for some more theoretical frameworks in which to think about it. And as Nandini pointed out, I've been looking at it more as this give and take, but I like the idea, and I'm definitely going to pursue that. I just wanted to say a couple of quick things because I learned so much from Shivangi's paper. I see all sorts of real comparisons between the work that we're doing, looking at a body and how it's constructed, and what does that mean for people to relate to one another in a governing body. So I hope that in the future we can talk more about that. That would be really great. And then I do have a suggestion perhaps about the public. I was also interested in this public opinion question. So how do you grasp that? And there are some newspapers that are available in digitized form through libraries. So it might be another place, Blessy, that you could look for some of the newspaper. I've been surprised at how many newspapers I can get access to through either HathiTrust or some of the libraries newspapers.
Thank you. I intend to do that.
Yeah, I do think that would be a really exciting addition. One more thing on Judge Jivan Ram. He was elected not on a reserved constituency. So he was
Wendy, one interjection. Wendy, this is Rohit. I will be making one interjection. I think there is already a question for you in the chat.
Okay.
Just in the chat room. Yeah, and after you conclude, we won't have much time. We have a panel coming up. So maybe the discussion between the panelists, I will forward you the mails. Maybe we can take it there. We have less than 10 minutes, like 15 minutes for the next panel. So Wendy, we'll just leave you to comment, and the interaction between the panelists, I'm sorry for this, but we'll leave it for another forum, another maybe mails. I'm sorry, Blessy. We just have 15 minutes for the next panel. So just sorry. So we'll let Wendy comment. The panelists can discuss later. Sorry.
Yes, Razak, thank you so much. That is exactly what I've been thinking about. This idea about engaging in democracy makes democracy. And there are, Naraja Gopal, there are a number of people who are thinking about this question of what is democracy? How do we redefine it? And thinking about democracy as practice rather than as an institution or an ideological idea, and certainly getting it out of the idea of a Western created system. Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't continue this discussion further. We have already overshot it by 20 minutes, but we'll continue this. The collective is now there, and hopefully Dr. Singha, Dr. Banerjee, Dr. Jaiswal, and Blessy will have more such discussions moving ahead. We have a panel in 15 minutes, so we'll look for our presenters and attendees to join that. Thank you, everyone. This is an enriching session. Thank you.
Thank you again, Rohit.